Chapter 18. A king at very arresto you not deserve to be thrown aside like a plebeian corpse which has no soul, and whose blood flows no longer in its veins. By a sermon of the bishop at the chapel of St. Clement on the 3rd of September at 10 o'clock in the evening, a gendarme woke up the whole of Verrières by galloping up the main street. He brought the news that His Majesty the King of would arrive the following Sunday, and it was already Tuesday. The prefect authorized, that is to say, demanded the forming of a guard of honor. They were to exhibit all possible pomp. An express messenger was sent to Vergy. De Rênal arrived during the night and found the town in a commotion. Each individual had his own pretensions. Those who were less busy hired balconies to see the king, who was to command the guard of honor. De Rênal at once realized how essential it was in the interests of the houses liable to have their frontage put back that de Moirod should have the command. That might entitle him to the post of first deputy mayor. There was nothing to say against the devoutness of de Moirod. It brooked no comparison, but he had never sat on a horse. He was a man of 36, timid in every way, and equally frightened of falling, and of looking ridiculous. The mayor had summoned him as early as 5 o'clock in the morning. "You see, monsieur, I ask your advice, as though you already occupy that post to which all the people on the right side want to carry you. In this unhappy town, manufacturers are prospering, the Liberal party is becoming possessed of millions, it aspires to power, it will manage to exploit everything to its own ends. Let us consult the interest of the king, the interest of the monarchy, and above all, the interest of our holy religion. Who do you think, monsieur, could be entrusted with the command of the guard of honor?" In spite of the terrible fear with which horses inspired him, de Moirod finished by accepting this honor like a martyr. "I shall know how to take the right tone," he said to the mayor. There was scarcely time enough to get ready the uniforms which had served 7 years ago on the occasion of the passage of a prince of the blood. At 7 o'clock, Madame de Rênal arrived at Vergy with Julien and the children. She found her drawing-room filled with liberal ladies who preached the union of all parties and had come to beg her to urge her husband to grant a place to theirs in the guard of honor. One of them actually asserted that if her husband was not chosen, he would go bankrupt out of chagrin. Madame de Rênal quickly got rid of all these people. She seemed very engrossed. Julien was astonished, and what was more, angry that she should make a mystery of what was disturbing her. "I had anticipated it," he said bitterly to himself. "Her love is being overshadowed by the happiness of receiving a king in her house. All this hubbub overcomes her. She will love me once more when the ideas of her caste no longer trouble her brain." An astonishing fact, he only loved her the more. The decorators began to fill the house. He watched a long time for the opportunity to exchange a few words. He eventually found her as she was coming out of his own room, carrying one of his suits. They were alone. He tried to speak to her. She ran away, refusing to listen to him. "I am an absolute fool to love a woman like that, whose ambition renders her as mad as her husband." She was madder. One of her great wishes, which she had never confessed to Julien for fear of shocking him, was to see him leave off, if only for one day, his gloomy black suit. With an adroitness which was truly admirable in so ingenuous a woman, she secured first from de Moirod and subsequently from the sub-perfect de Maugrin, an assurance that Julien should be nominated a guard of honor in preference to 5 or 6 young people, the sons of very well-off manufacturers, of whom 2 at least were models of piety. De Vailnaud, who reckoned on lending his carriage to the prettiest women in the town, and on showing off his fine Norman steeds, consented to let Julien, the being he hated most in the whole world, have one of his horses. But all the guards of honor either possessed or had borrowed one of those pretty sky-blue uniforms with 2 silver colonel epaulets, which had shone 7 years ago. Madame de Rênal wanted a new uniform, and she only had 4 days in which to send to Besançon and get from there the uniform, the arms, the hat, etc., everything necessary for a guard of honor. The most delightful part of it was that she thought it imprudent to get Julien's uniform made at Verrières. She wanted to surprise both him and the town. Having settled the questions of the guards of honor and of the public welcome finished, the mayor had now to organize a great religious ceremony. The king of did not wish to pass through Verrières without visiting the famous relic of Saint Clement, which is kept at Bray-le-Haut, barely a league from the town. The authorities wanted to have a numerous attendance of the clergy, but this matter was the most difficult to arrange. Maslon, the new cure, wanted to avoid at any price the presence of Chalin. It was in vain that de Rênal tried to represent to him that it would be imprudent to do so. The Marquis de la Mole, whose ancestors had been governors of the province for so many generations, had been chosen to accompany the king of. He had known the Abbé Chalin for 30 years. He would certainly ask news of him when he arrived at Verrières, and if he found him disgraced, he was the very man to go and rout him out in the little house to which he had retired, accompanied by all the escort that he had at his disposition. What a rebuff that would be! I shall be disgraced both here and at Besançon, answered the Abbé Maslon, if he appears among my clergy. A Jansenist, by the Lord. Whatever you can say, my dear Abbé, replied de Rênal, I'll never expose the administration of Verrières to receiving such an affront from de la Mole. You do not know him. He is orthodox enough at court, but here in the provinces he is a satirical wit and cynic, whose only object is to make people uncomfortable. He is capable of covering us with ridicule in the eyes of the liberals, simply in order to amuse himself. It was only on the night between the Saturday and the Sunday, after 3 whole days of negotiations, that the pride of the Abbé Maslon bent before the fear of the mayor, which was now changing into courage. It was necessary to write a honeyed letter to the Abbé Chalin, begging him to be present at the ceremony in connection with the relic of Bray-le-Haut, if, of course, his great age and his infirmity allowed him to do so. Chalin asked for and obtained a letter of invitation for Julien, who was to accompany him as his subdeacon. From the beginning of the Sunday morning, thousands of peasants began to arrive from the neighboring mountains and to inundate the streets of Verrières. It was the finest sunshine. Finally, about 3 o'clock, a thrill swept through all this crowd. A great fire had been perceived on a rock 2 leagues from Verrières. This signal announced that the king had just entered the territory of the department. At the same time, the sound of all the bells and the repeated volleys from an old Spanish cannon which belonged to the town testified to its joy at this great event. Half the population climbed onto the roofs. All the women were on the balconies. The guard of honor started to march. The brilliant uniforms were universally admired. Everybody recognized a relative or a friend. They made fun of the timidity of de Moirod, whose prudent hand was ready every single minute to catch hold of his saddlebow. But one remark resulted in all the others being forgotten. The first cavalier in the 9th line was a very pretty, slim boy who was not recognized at first. He soon created a general sensation, as some uttered a cry of indignation, and others were dumbfounded with astonishment. They recognized in this young man, who was sitting one of the Norman horses of Valenod, little Sorel, the carpenter's son. There was a unanimous outcry against the mayor, above all on the part of the liberals. What? Because this little laborer, who masqueraded as an abbé, was tutor to his brats, he had the audacity to nominate him guard of honor to the prejudice of rich manufacturers like so-and-so and so-and-so. Those gentlemen, said a banker's wife, ought to put that insolent gutter boy in his proper place. He is cunning and carries a saber, answered her neighbor. He would be dastardly enough to slash them in the face. The conversation of aristocratic society was more dangerous. The ladies began to ask each other if the mayor alone was responsible for this grave impropriety. Speaking generally, they did justice to his contempt for lack of birth. Julien was the happiest of men, while he was the subject of so much conversation. Bold by nature, he sat a horse better than the majority of the young men of this mountain town. He saw that, in the eyes of the women, he was the topic of interest. His epaulets were more brilliant than those of the others, because they were new. His horse pranced at every moment. He reached the zenith of joy. His happiness was unbounded when, as they passed by the old rampart, the noise of the little cannon made his horse prance outside the line. By a great piece of luck he did not fall. From that moment he felt himself a hero. He was one of Napoleon's officers of artillery, and was charging a battery. One person was happier than he. She had first seen him pass from one of the folding windows in the Hôtel de Ville. Then, taking her carriage and rapidly making a long detour, she arrived in time to shudder when his horse took him outside the line. Finally, she put her carriage to the gallop, left by another gate of the town, succeeded in rejoining the route by which the king was to pass, and was able to follow the guard of honor at 20 paces distance in the midst of a noble dust. 6,000 peasants cried, "Long live the king," when the mayor had the honor to harangue his majesty. An hour afterwards, when all the speeches had been listened to, and the king was going to enter the town, the little cannon began again to discharge its spasmodic volleys. But an accident ensued, the victim being, not one of the cannoneers who had proved their mettle at Leipzig and at Montreuil, but the future deputy mayor, M. de Moirod. His horse gently laid him in the one heap of mud on the high road, a somewhat scandalous circumstance, inasmuch as it was necessary to extricate him to allow the king to pass. His Majesty alighted at the fine new church, which was decked out today with all its crimson curtains. The king was due to dine, and then afterwards take his carriage again and go and pay his respects to the celebrated relic of Saint Clement. Scarcely was the king in the church than Julien galloped towards the house of M. de Rênal. Once there he doffed with a sigh his fine sky-blue uniform, his sabre and his epaulets, to put on again his shabby little black suit. He mounted his horse again, and in a few moments was at Bray-le-Haut, which was on the summit of a very pretty hill. Enthusiasm is responsible for these numbers of peasants, thought Julien. It was impossible to move a step at Verrières, and here there were more than 10,000 round this ancient abbey. Half ruined by the vandalism of the Revolution, it had been magnificently restored since the Restoration, and people were already beginning to talk of miracles. Julien rejoined the Abbé Chélan, who scolded him roundly and gave him a cassock and a surplice. He dressed quickly and followed M. Chélan, who was going to pay a call on the young Bishop of Agde. He was a nephew of M. de la Mole, who had been recently nominated and had been charged with the duty of showing the relic to the king. But the bishop was not to be found. The clergy began to get impatient. It was awaiting its chief in the somber Gothic cloister of the ancient abbey. 24 cures had been brought together so as to represent the ancient chapter of Bray-le-Haut, which before 1789 consisted of 24 canons. The cures, having deplored the bishop's youth for 3/4 of an hour, thought it fitting for their senior to visit Monseigneur to apprise him that the king was on the point of arriving, and that it was time to betake himself to the choir. The great age of M. Chélan gave him the seniority. In spite of the bad temper which he was manifesting to Julien, he signed him to follow. Julien was wearing his surplice with distinction. By means of some trick or other of ecclesiastical dress, he had made his fine curling hair very flat, but by a forgetfulness, which redoubled the anger of M. Chélan, the spurs of the guard of honor could be seen below the long folds of his cassock. When they arrived at the bishop's apartment, the tall lackeys with their lace frills scarcely deigned to answer the old cure to the effect that Monseigneur was not receiving. They made fun of him when he tried to explain that in his capacity of senior member of the chapter of Bray-le-Haut, he had the privilege of being admitted at any time to the officiating bishop. Julien's haughty temper was shocked by the lackey's insolence. He started to traverse the corridors of the ancient abbey, and to shake all the doors which he found. A very small one yielded to his efforts, and he found himself in a cell in the midst of Monseigneur's valets, who were dressed in black suits with chains on their necks. His hurried manner made these gentlemen think that he had been sent by the bishop, and they let him pass. He went some steps further on, and found himself in an immense Gothic hall, which was extremely dark, and completely wainscot in black oak. The ogive windows had all been walled in with brick except one. There was nothing to disguise the coarseness of this masonry, which offered a melancholy contrast to the ancient magnificence of the woodwork. The two great sides of this hall, so celebrated among Burgundian antiquaries, and built by the Duke Charles the Bold, about 1470 in expiation of some sin, were adorned with richly sculptured wooden stalls. All the mysteries of the apocalypse were to be seen portrayed in wood of different colors. This melancholy magnificence, debased as it was by the sight of the bare bricks and the plaster, which was still quite white, affected Julien. He stopped in silence. He saw at the other extremity of the hall Near the one window which let in the daylight, a movable mahogany mirror. A young man in a violet robe and a lace surplice, but with his head bare, was standing still 3 paces from the glass. This piece of furniture seemed strange in a place like this, and had doubtless been only brought there on the previous day. Julian thought that the young man had the appearance of being irritated. He was solemnly giving benedictions with his right hand close to the mirror. What can this mean, he thought. Is this young priest performing some preliminary ceremony? Perhaps he is the bishop's secretary. He will be as insolent as the lackeys. Never mind, though. Let us try. He advanced and traversed somewhat slowly the length of the hall, with his gaze fixed all the time on the one window and looking at the young man, who continued without any intermission bestowing slowly an infinite number of blessings. The nearer he approached, the better he could distinguish his angry manner. The richness of the lace surplice stopped Julian in spite of himself some paces in front of the mirror. "It is my duty to speak," he said to himself at last. But the beauty of the hall had moved him, and he was already upset by the harsh words he anticipated. The young man saw him in the mirror, turned round, and suddenly discarding his angry manner, said to him in the gentlest tone, "Well, monsieur, has it been arranged at last?" Julian was dumbfounded. As the young man began to turn towards him, Julian saw the pectoral cross on his breast. It was the Bishop of Agde. As young as that, thought Julian. At most 6 or 8 years older than I am. He was ashamed of his spurs. "Monseigneur," he said at last, "I am sent by M. Chelan, the senior of the chapter." He has been well recommended to me," said the bishop in a polished tone which doubled Julian's delight. "But I beg your pardon, monsieur, I mistook you for the person who was to bring me my mitre. It was badly packed at Paris. The silver cloth towards the top has been terribly spoiled. It will look awful," ended the young bishop sadly, "and besides, I am being kept waiting. Monseigneur, I will go and fetch the mitre if your grace will let me." Julian's fine eyes did their work. "Go, monsieur," answered the bishop, with charming politeness. "I need it immediately. I am grieved to keep the gentlemen of the chapter waiting." When Julian reached the center of the hall, he turned round towards the bishop and saw that he had again commenced giving benedictions. What can it be? Julian asked himself. No doubt it is a necessary ecclesiastical preliminary for the ceremony which is to take place. When he reached the cell in which the valets were congregated, he saw the mitre in their hands. These gentlemen succumbed in spite of themselves to his imperious look and gave him Monseigneur's mitre. He felt proud to carry it. As he crossed the hall, he walked slowly. He held it with reverence. He found the bishop seated before the glass, but from time to time, his right hand, although fatigued, still gave a blessing. Julian helped him to adjust his mitre. The bishop shook his head. "Ah, it will keep on," he said to Julian with an air of satisfaction. "Do you mind going a little way off?" Then the bishop went very quickly to the center of the room, then approached the mirror, again resumed his angry manner, and gravely began to give blessings. Julian was motionless with astonishment. He was tempted to understand, but did not dare. The bishop stopped, and suddenly abandoning his grave manner looked at him and said, "What do you think of my mitre, monsieur? Is it on right?" "Qui treibt, monseigneur." "It is not too far back? That would look a little silly, but I mustn't on the other hand wear it down over the eyes like an officer's shako. It seems to me to be on quite right. The king of is accustomed to a venerable clergy, who are doubtless very solemn. I should not like to appear lacking in dignity, especially by reason of my youth." And the bishop started again to walk about and give benedictions. "It is quite clear," said Julian, daring to understand at last. "He is practicing giving his benediction." "I am ready," the bishop said after a few moments. "Go, monsieur, and advise the senior and the gentlemen of the chapter." Soon M. Chelan, followed by the 2 oldest cures, entered by a big, magnificently sculptured door, which Julian had not previously noticed. But this time he remained in his place quite at the back, and was only able to see the bishop over the shoulders of ecclesiastics who were pressing at the door in crowds. The bishop began slowly to traverse the hall. When he reached the threshold, the cures formed themselves into a procession. After a short moment of confusion, the procession began to march, intoning the psalm. The bishop, who was between Chelan and a very old cure, was the last to advance. Julien being in attendance on the Abbé, Chelan managed to get quite near Monseigneur. They followed the long corridors of the Abbey of Bray-le-Haut. In spite of the brilliant sun, they were dark and damp. They arrived finally at the portico of the cloister. Julien was dumbfounded with admiration for so fine a ceremony. His emotions were divided between thoughts of his own ambition, which had been reawakened by the bishop's youth, and thoughts of the latter's refinement and exquisite politeness. This politeness was quite different to that of de Rênal, even on his good days. "The higher you lift yourself towards the first rank of society," said Julien to himself, "the more charming manners you find." They entered the church by a side door. Suddenly an awful noise made the ancient walls echo. Julien thought they were going to crumble. It was the little piece of artillery again. It had been drawn at a gallop by 8 horses, and had just arrived. Immediately on its arrival it had been run out by the Leipzig cannoneers and fired 5 shots a minute, as though the Prussians had been the target. But this admirable noise no longer produced any effect on Julien. He no longer thought of Napoleon and military glory. To be Bishop of Agde so young, he thought. But where is Agde? How much does it bring in? 200,000 or 300,000 francs, perhaps. Monseigneur's lackeys appeared with a magnificent canopy. Chelan took one of the poles, but as a matter of fact it was Julien who carried it. The bishop took his place underneath. He had really succeeded in looking old, and our hero's admiration was now quite unbounded. What can't one accomplish with skill, he thought. The king entered. Julien had the good fortune to see him at close quarters. The bishop began to harangue him with unction, without forgetting a little nuance of very polite anxiety for His Majesty. We will not repeat a description of the ceremony of Bray-le-Haut. They filled all the columns of the journals of the department for a fortnight on end. Julien learnt from the bishop that the king was descended from Charles the Bold. At a later date, it was one of Julien's duties to check the accounts of the cost of this ceremony. De la Mole, who had succeeded in procuring a bishopric for his nephew, had wished to do him the favor of being himself responsible for all the expenses. The ceremony alone of Bray-le-Haut cost 3,800 francs. After the speech of the bishop and the answer of the king, His Majesty took up a position underneath the canopy, and then knelt very devoutly on a cushion near the altar. The choir was surrounded by stalls, and the stalls were raised 2 steps from the pavement. It was at the bottom of these steps that Julien sat at the feet of de Chelan, almost like a train-bearer sitting next to his cardinal in the Sixtine Chapel at Rome. There was a Te Deum, floods of incense, innumerable volleys of musketry and artillery. The peasants were drunk with happiness and piety. A day like this undoes the work of 100 numbers of the Jacobin papers. Julien was 6 paces from the king, who was really praying with devotion. He noticed for the first time a little man with a witty expression, who wore an almost plain suit. But he had a sky-blue ribbon over this very simple suit. He was nearer the king than many other lords, whose clothes were embroidered with gold to such an extent that, to use Julien's expression, it was impossible to see the cloth. He learnt some minutes later that it was Monsieur de la Mole. He thought he looked haughty, and even insolent. "I'm sure this marquis is not so polite as my pretty bishop," he thought. The ecclesiastical calling makes men mild and good. But the king has come to venerate the relic, and I don't see a trace of the relic. Where has Saint Clement got to? A little priest who sat next to him informed him that the venerable relic was at the top of the building in a chapelle ardente. "What is a chapelle ardente?" said Julien to himself, but he was reluctant to ask the meaning of this word. He redoubled his attention. The etiquette on the occasion of a visit of a sovereign prince is that the canons do not accompany the bishop. But, as he started on his march to the chapelle ardente, my Lord Bishop of Agde called the Abbé Chelan. Julien dared to follow him. Having climbed up a long staircase, they reached an extremely small door, whose Gothic frame was magnificently gilded. This work looked as though it had been constructed the day before. 24 young girls belonging to the most distinguished families in Verrières were assembled in front of the door. The bishop knelt down in the midst of these pretty maidens before he opened the door. While he was praying aloud, They seemed unable to exhaust their admiration for his fine lace, his gracious mien, and his young and gentle face. This spectacle deprived our hero of his last remnants of reason. At this moment he would have fought for the Inquisition, and with a good conscience. The door suddenly opened. The little chapel was blazing with light. More than 1,000 candles could be seen before the altar, divided into 8 lines and separated from each other by bouquets of flowers. The suave odor of the purest incense eddied out from the door of the sanctuary. The chapel, which had been newly gilded, was extremely small but very high. Julian noticed that there were candles more than 15 feet high upon the altar. The young girls could not restrain a cry of admiration. Only the 24 young girls, the 2 cures and Julian, had been admitted into the little vestibule of the chapel. Soon the king arrived, followed by Monsieur de la Mole and his great chamberlain. The guards themselves remained outside kneeling and presenting arms. His Majesty precipitated, rather than threw himself, onto the stool. It was only then that Julian, who was keeping close to the gilded door, perceived over the bare arm of a young girl the charming statue of Saint Clement. It was hidden under the altar, and bore the dress of a young Roman soldier. It had a large wound on its neck, from which the blood seemed to flow. The artist had surpassed himself. The eyes, which though dying were full of grace, were half closed. A budding mustache adored that charming mouth which, though half closed, seemed notwithstanding to be praying. The young girl next to Julian wept warm tears at the sight. One of her tears fell on Julian's hand, after a moment of prayer in the profoundest silence, that was only broken by the distant sound of the bells of all the villages within a radius of 10 leagues. The Bishop of Agde asked the king's permission to speak. He finished a short but very touching speech with a passage, the very simplicity of which assured its effectiveness. Never forget, young Christian women, that you have seen one of the greatest kings of the world on his knees before the servants of this almighty and terrible God. These servants, feeble, persecuted, assassinated as they were on earth, as you can see by the still bleeding wounds of Saint Clement, will triumph in heaven. You will remember them, my young Christian women, will you not, this day forever, and will detest the infidel. You will be forever faithful to this God who is so great, so terrible, but so good. With these words the bishop rose authoritatively. You promise me? He said, lifting up his arm with an inspired air. We promise, said the young girls, melting into tears. I accept your promise in the name of the terrible God, added the bishop in a thunderous voice, and the ceremony was at an end. The king himself was crying. It was only a long time afterwards that Julian had sufficient self-possession to inquire, where were the bones of the saint that had been sent from Rome to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy? He was told that they were hidden in the charming waxen figure. His Majesty deigned to allow the young ladies who had accompanied him into the chapel to wear a red ribbon on which were embroidered these words, Hate of the infidel, perpetual adoration. Monsieur de la Mole had 10,000 bottles of wine distributed among the peasants. In the evening at Verrières, the Liberals made a point of having illuminations which were 100 times better than those of the Royalists. Before leaving, the king paid a visit to M. de Moirod.